Y'all ready?
Yeah.
So tonight, there are three things I'd like to talk about. One is the setting, just to give us some real kind of depth to the background, but also because I thought of a brilliant article for one of you to write. I'm too tired. And then I want to talk about words and how language works in this novel, because I think it's really important. And then finally, religion. Get you people worked up about something. So I'm sorry John Bailey's not here, because you know the Appalachians are his people.
Right.
I want to start at the beginning.
Thank you, Sally.
Nobody was talking about it.
Nobody was talking about it. Oh. Well.
There's a place.
Okay, you ready, John Bailey?
I am more than ready.
Giddy up.
You better watch it.
Okay. So we mentioned this last week, but I kind of wanted to dig into it a little bit. Looking at Appalachia as the background of the novel. So what are some of the things you noticed in the first 100 pages or so? What kinds of evaluations could you make about Appalachia?
Well,
Mountainous, yes, good.
my main impression of the first 100 or so pages is how she nails the accent and the idiom, the vernacular, every part of it. My grandmother is in McMinnville, and over that way.
Oh, yes.
And it just like her.
And when she talks about this novel, Barbara Kingsolver said that was front and center for her, trying to get his voice right. And she said at one point, when she was drafting, she did a search for all the F words, how many times Demon had said the F word. And she realized that, within the first, I think it was like 150 pages, he'd already said it like 147 times. And so she said that was too much. She knew that was too much. And so she said she had to go all the way back and start over. And so his voice for her was the most significant thing in the creation of this novel, and what most critics argue is the best part of the book. So yes, she really understands the vernacular of the region. Okay, mountainous, vernacular, what else? Poor, good.
Let me tell you about my great-grandmother.
Oh, please do.
My great-grandmother's name was Belle Percival. This is a true story. And she grew up in a holler on a branch of the Cumberland River. And the first time I ever saw my great-grandmother was she came around the corner of my grandmother, her daughter's house. And she had on a calico dress and a big sun hat. And she had an apron, and she had her hands wrapped up in that apron. That's the way and tennis shoes. She was about 90. She died at 98. And we always said that she had a bottle of moonshine wrapped up in her apron. Now, whether she did or not, I do not know. But she would come by the house about every other day, walking from her house 2 miles up the holler to visit in the morning. And she was sweet as she could be, and had no education, none. Her daughter did, my grandmother, she insisted, needed to go to college, and she went to LMU, Lincoln Memorial University, which is in Harrogate, Tennessee, just right over the Kentucky line. But these are country folks. They were farmers, in coal country certainly, but they had some bottom land that they were able to farm. And, that's my first experience with Appalachia. And that's my family, that's my heritage. She was wonderful,
Yeah.
wonderful, sweet, just great.
So I think this is really important.
I would say exploited area too.
Yes. So one of the things that Barbara Kingsolver has to do in this book, and you have to decide how well you think she does it, because I think she rides a fine line between pointing out all the ways in which this region has suffered from poverty and exploitation, and at the same time, a place of plain folks. And so, what she has to be really careful of is not reinforcing negative stereotypes of Appalachian people. And you have to decide if you think she does that well. Some critics have argued that the only real weakness of the book is that when she talks about the exploitation, she gets preachy, like lectury, and kind of moves away from demons or authentic voice, and kind of is like, okay, here's what's wrong with foster care, and here's what's going on with tobacco and all of that sort of thing. Because John's right. When you think about Appalachian history, this is a mountain culture. And we generally think of it as Southern, although, the Appalachian Mountains, it's a long, wide range of people and communities. And this concept of the hillbilly doesn't even appear in print until the early 20th century. Appalachian people have always referred to themselves as plain folks. Not hillbillies. And at one point, do you remember, Demon says for them, it's like the N-word. And you watch the way in which, and we're going to talk about language, the ways in which they will use the word hillbilly to kind of own it and make fun of it, sort of deflate the meaning. This was and remains in smaller ways an agricultural mass, an agricultural people. In the 19th century, there were a few slaveholding farms, not many. Herders, tenant farmers, but what we understand and know of the culture, which is very clear, I think, is that self-sufficiency is one of their defining characteristics. If we are talking about Southern Appalachia, we are usually talking about the Blue Ridge, Cumberland, Allegheny, and the key to the economic life there, and you see it on Creaky Farm, was livestock herding, that a lot of people don't associate with this difficult mountainous range. But you also had, from the beginning, depressed rural neighborhoods that were called settlements, and Demon tells you about that early on in the novel. Often the houses were built on horizontal logs because of rain. widespread evangelical Protestant churches, and we'll talk about that in a minute. The idea of free range herding disappeared after the Civil War. And what happens after the war is that the economy in the mountains couldn't really establish itself because of the poor soil and the rugged terrain. And what most people associate with Appalachia is this idea that they're this enclave of isolated people who have never been in touch with, you know, civilization, and all of that is patently untrue. It's in the late 19th century that Appalachia became the focus of journalists, social workers, missionaries, educators who pour into those mountains to try to. So this is where things get really complicated, because in their estimation, this was all done in the name of good intentions, trying to bring education, more mainstream religion, trying to teach people about hygiene, all the things that they didn't really need help for. And yet that attention starts showing up, you know, in the media. And so the word hillbilly first appears in 1900. And at the time, it was connected to music. Go ahead.
Just to add, my people always refer to themselves as mountain people. And they use that term very willingly. That's what they call themselves, or country folk. And they were, as you suggested, basically farmers, is what they did. But for them, education was really important. They all were educated people because there was a lot of self-education, certainly.
Yes.
Homeschooling and that kind of thing, but then they went off to higher education. For whatever reason, I don't know what's motivated that, but they did.
Well, education traditionally has represented this sense of another way of living, another way of it's connected to this idea of success. Part of what's so difficult for Appalachian communities that you also see during Demon's tobacco days is that they often couldn't go to school all the time. I mean, when I was in high school, we lived, of course, in a very rural area, and we would get 6 weeks off during the school year.
Where was that?
North Carolina, for tobacco, putting in tobacco, and those who were not connected to farming would go to school, and it was more like babysitting. It was the most interesting experience because that's never happened to me anywhere else in the South, where the school sets up 6 weeks off for the children. And school is so often interrupted because of the need to survive, right? That children are important in that economy. So I want you to consider as you move through the ways in which, well, you have to decide, do you think she is working against stereotype or she falls into that occasionally? The other thing I want you to think about is the culture of Appalachia, because this is when we're going to get into some fun stuff. When we think about Appalachia, what's clear is that you have a combination of races and ethnicities. So the Appalachia region is originally populated by Native Americans, who are sort of pushed out in the way that most Native Americans were in the 19th century. And then in the 17th and 18th century, you have Europeans coming into Appalachia, especially Scottish, Irish, Welsh. And what you begin to see is a real kind of combination of cultural, religious, traditions that become kind of syncretic. And I want you to keep that in mind, because you do get in this novel, and we set it up last time, a focus on folklore in this area, the things that Demon hears or believes, and what people believe about him. So I also want you to get a sense of the religious systems in this area, because they're mostly based on Protestant Christianity. Even the Native Americans in the area ended up sort of assimilating or embracing Protestant Christianity, but the vast majority of those churches are run by lay people. And so you often get a lot of non-standardized interpretations of Christian doctrine. And you all know some of that, because folk religions in Appalachia, we think of as really hardcore evangelical. And those represent the majority of Christianity in the Appalachians, but y'all, there are Protestants, Scotch Irish, come on, the Black Irish. There are Irish, there are Presbyterians. Remember when we read Lee Smith, she listed the value system of each of the Protestant churches. Now, some of the more unique practices that we don't see in most traditional Protestant churches include things like full immersion baptism still in rivers, snake handling, which Demon talks about, a lot of Pentecostal holiness churches that are sort of seriously hardcore. But here's what I want you also to get. In Appalachia, folklore, superstition, and religion combine in terms of the understanding of the culture. And because they are were so self-sustaining, so much of what they believe about the universe is connected to nature. And when John was telling the story about his grandmother, the whole time in my head, I was going, no, she did not have moonshine. She was a granny witch. Do you know what a granny witch is? So in Appalachia, there's a whole tradition of holistic folk medicine and faith healing. And it's based on the medicinal properties of roots and flowers and all of that. And I'm kidding, she may not have been, but usually they were older women who kind of took up that position as the healers, in part because they were remote and didn't have access to a lot of traditional health care. At the same time, there is so much fun folklore connected to this region. Here's one. Are you ready? So we mentioned this last time, but I want to talk about Melungeons, because this is a big deal in the book. And we talked about the Melungeons as this combination of a number of races and ethnicities, but listen to this. So most of the Melungeon community has been assimilated into mainstream Appalachia now, but in the 19th and for much of the 20th century, the Melungeons were a community of people that in many ways suffered from being outsiders in a community of outsiders. Does that make sense? And at the same time, sometimes feared. And they went through, and this will be Donovan's test, because I didn't have time to do this research, but you tell me. They were also called Mekashipa, which is a word that originally appears in the Hebrew Bible and is linked to witchcraft or sorcery. I don't know about that, Donovan, check it out, okay? Don't say no, you'll ruin my whole brilliant paper I've got in my head now. And they were clearly associated with the folk spiritual practices of the region, including speaking heat out of burns. So if you got burned, they would speak it out. This is also important in evangelical Christianity, the idea of speaking something into being. And we're going to talk about that because it's huge in this novel.
Were they in any way, I don't know about this, related to the blue people?
They are the, well,
Because they all had that genetic defect or aberration, so to speak, that affected their complexion. And
some people mix them up. In other words, Melungeons were often called blue people because the tint of their skin, but they are a separate.
that's what I thought. The blue
group.
people that I recollect mostly came from eastern Kentucky. But the Melungeons were all through the Appalachian
Yes.
area, so to speak, as I wow. Maybe blue people, that makes sense too.
Now the Melungeons that sort of identify as a separate community are up in the Great Lakes region. I'm not sure why they chose that, but from the beginning, the Melungeons were seen as a demonized people with cursed souls. So this is significant because Demon tells you right in the first couple of pages that he feels marked, right? But at the same time, he's the one born with the call. And in Melungeon folklore, children born with a call are healers, this is important, healers, and spiritually sacred. So in a lot of ways, Demon, I think this is brilliant, that Kingsolver includes this superstition and a lot of this folklore, but you'd have to be aware of it to pick up a lot of it in the novel as it moves forward. But I do think it becomes clear even at the beginning that you have to decide if Demon is a folklore hero, if he is a magical figure. The magical child is a trope of folklore, right? Is there something sacred and special about him that elevates? One of the things Barbara Kingsolver said when she was talking about that thing about taking a lot of the curse words out was that what she really wanted is for you to want to adopt Demon. Do you want to?
Sometimes.
Yeah, okay.
All right, we're gonna get into that. Oh my gosh, what is? Now, here's my thing. You ready? One of the other spiritual practices of the Melungians, and actually this is a much wider spread tradition, and it's European. I mean, it comes over from Europe. They have the tradition of what's called sin eaters. Do you know what that means?
But you know what?
Sin eaters.
Then you-
Oh my gosh, this is so cool. And this is a real thing. It goes all the way into the 20th century. So this is a death ritual or piece of folklore. And what would happen is, especially in the 19th century, when someone would die in Appalachia, they would lay the dead person out in their homes, right? On a door. Those who had some money would get this thing called a cooling board. I don't know if you've heard, it's really fascinating. But they had a series of rituals that they would perform on the body. And one of those was that they would bake these death cakes of bread and put them on the chest of the deceased person. And then there was a defined figure in the community called the sin eater. And the family would hire the sin eater to come into the home after a day or whatever and eat the bread that had absorbed the dead person's sin. And then the sin eater would be paid, in part because the sin eater becomes this exiled figure in the community. Lives, it's usually a man, lives on his own because nobody wants to be with the sin eater, right? Who just as practice is this, and this is really, really true. And this isn't just folklore, this is a real person who ends up sort of being in exile on the edge of town. And that's how he makes his living. So he becomes this spiritual and feared figure who absorbs all of the sins of the community.
The Catholics do the same thing.
Do they?
Well, extreme unction, all
Oh, yeah.
absolving the dead person of their sins. We ought to do that, I think, in Presbyterian church.
I do it with you, John, but it wears me out.
For real.
Don't the ants come in on the bread or the cake
Oh, God.
in the, you know, in the. Well, ants would give you fresh protein.
Oh, I thought you,
Yeah, we got ants and uncles.
I wasn't getting that. Here's the thing. So I was thinking about this today, you know, because I was going through and I was going, oh my gosh, is demon being set up to be the sin eater? Which would play into that whole kind of concept of him as this kind of spiritual or magical figure from the beginning. And in some ways, does he absorb all of the sins of that community, right? From the time he is young, you know, he's sort of the wanderer, right? He never actually has a home. And eventually you'll see how he leaves. If he is a sin eater, that doesn't just kind of make him a magical spiritual figure. It's just another really interesting way that King Solver is able to kind of put that folklore into the novel in a really subtle way. That's a brilliant article. John Bailey, write that. What do you think? do you know what I'm talking about? Him as a sin eater, what would that mean exactly? What does he absorb in this place?
All the bad choices.
Right. So we're gonna see, right, that he absorbs the drug addiction, yes? And poverty. Do what? Homelessness, yes. And then, of course, the deaths of his mother and that just heartbreaking scene where he realizes that he lost his brother, right, when his mother dies. And then the brother is sort of this imagined figure. Violence, right? Exploitation. And so if he is, and I don't want to impose this on you, I just think it's a really fascinating idea, because either way, he does become the carrier of all of these sins. What does Kingsolver ultimately have to say about the possibility of redemption for him? And how would that happen? At the beginning of this novel, in the first, 20 chapters, how does Demon talk about Christianity? Does it lots of times. Do what?
Dismissively.
Yes, why dismissively?
Because he didn't see that it gave his mother any help.
Yes. So at the very beginning, Demon sort of sets up this idea that you have to work out as the novel goes on. One is about this notion of free will, yes? On the one hand, he's marked. On the other hand, he thinks he has a fighting chance. On the other hand, he keeps showing you all of the power of these forces that are working against him, yes? And he ends up, at least in this first big section, talking about religion as if he's left out, which brings up, one of the most fundamental difficult questions, right, about Christianity. What about all those people who suffer so much, right? What's wrong? What is this, their choices that make things bad? Because another thing Kingsolver sets up early in the novel is that exploitation of the area. He talks about the mining, yes, and then the subsistence farming, that whole thing about tobacco and the ways in which, on the one hand, they've been encouraged to grow it, but also consume it, and therefore hurt themselves. And you have all of these kind of perpetuating cycles. Okay, whose fault is this? Is it the fault of the Appalachian people? Or we could say, there's that great sort of moment where he's at Creaky Farm and they're going to have a farm party. And he figures out it's PHARM, farm party. And you go, okay, what do we do as Christians when we grapple with this question? I mean, it's a fundamental question about suffering, isn't it? Which is one of the hardest things to deal with ever, yes? I mean, and then how do we deal with that, right? Do we go, well, this is a test, right? Suffering is a test. Suffering makes you grateful for your other blessings. But what we mostly don't do as a community is go, okay, what about those people who suffer all the time, right?
You all help me, because I really cannot remember as I leaf back through this thing, but I think that Demon throughout asked that fundamental question of
Yes,
why do these things happen?
happen.
And I mean, that's a crucial faith issue for all of us.
Yes. And one of the things I think is so like I physically felt like I cringed when he realizes that his mother dies from oxy, and he doesn't even know what that is. But then there's this long explanation that sort of sets up, here's the thing about oxy. It's a miracle. It's a miracle drug. Which is how it was sold. Yes, just like that. I wasn't alive, but I heard this. Because Valium was sold that way in the 60s. It was mother's little miracle helper. And then you go, okay, hold on. That's weird language to use, right? Because it's real uncomfortable in the sense that being out of pain does feel miraculous, yeah? And on a much, much smaller scale, PS, like, you know, with my arm, 18 months of being in pain every day. And there were days where I would go, I just don't know how people do this, that have real chronic pain or illness. Like, it could make you go crazy, right? And there are days when you're going, I just would like to have a day off, you know? And so Demon doesn't know what this is, and he knows it killed his mother, but then it's also set up as a miracle in a place where miracles don't seem easy to come by. Yes? And then all of that stuff gets mixed up together. Economy, religion, free will, chance. And I don't know ultimately what we're going to do about all of that, you know?
You think about the corporate evil of the family that is making the drug, knows that it's a pain reliever for people who are suffering all sorts of different kinds of pain.
Yes.
I mean, that's grapes of wrath too, right? I mean,
Yes.
it's that you know the need, and like the devil, you just provide the cure.
Yes, and that's a beautiful way to put it, because what she is doing in this whole novel is consistently kind of creating this tension or pushing up against one another, this idea of demon, devil, and God salvation. Yes. And ultimately what comes into that mix, because not only, John, I think you're right, what Demon is constantly thinking is why, right? Why did things happen? And remember, he's 10 and then he becomes 11 at the worst birthday party ever, right?
Keeps pulling out though. I
What do
mean,
you mean?
he keeps surviving. but
Yes.
Sometimes it's by, you think there's no way he's gonna get out of whatever the situation is, and he's clawing his way back up. He does that with some strength inside of him that wants to survive.
Yes, do you remember? Right, maybe it was at the birthday, I can't remember, when the social worker says, what do you want to be when you grow up? And there's that, it's a beautiful moment where he's like, what?
Yeah.
Never thought of that.
Never thought about that.
But right there, to me, is a crucial flaw in the book,
Oh, what is it?
because he is, as you just said, 11 and 12 years, he is, and yet he doesn't respond to a lot of these situations as an 11 or 12-year-old
Mhm.
at all.
I think that's the challenge of It is written backwards, and yet it's written through the 11-year-old adult,
Mhm.
which is,
The other thing, y'all, and I mean this seriously. I think for most of us who are, trying to usher our children into adulthood or whatever, we think of a 10-year-old, so that's like 5th grade.
Yeah.
We think of them as children and we want them to be children. What I think we don't get to see is that 10 and 11-year-olds in really horrifying conditions often react to things on a level that we don't understand. And I'm thinking about my ex-husband, God bless. When he was 10, his parents got divorced. So he's 5th grade. He's got 2 younger sisters. And his mother did not cope well. So she becomes an alcoholic, and like a terrible alcoholic. And one of the things he did every single day from 5th grade to 12th grade, he would have to get up before the girls, figure out where his mother was and what she had done to herself that day, get her into bed so the girls wouldn't see that, then get the girls on the bus, get to school himself, get home before the girls to see what mother had done for the rest of the day. Okay, 10 years old. And we think, no, that's not right. Yes, that's not our experience. So on the one hand, I think when you are clawing to survive, you are thinking and working beyond your years. At the same time, I also think this is an issue of narration, that he is an adult looking back. And I mean,
Interpreting it through adulthood.
yes, and come on, most of us can't remember what we were thinking when we were 10 years old. And so as
it's fascinating, right? I mean, that's a sophistication of a childhood conversation.
yes.
I mean, that's,
And then this is very Faulknerian. Well, Faulkner, because Faulkner does this a lot, where they have a retrospective narrator as a child. And what Faulkner will say, this is from this great story called Barn Burning in Hill. He goes, what I would have said, if I could have said, was this. And I think that's what's going on sometimes with him, which makes it complicated, the narration. And because I'm like you, there are moments in this book where I'm going, is this a mistake? Is this a hedge? I'm not quite sure. And then I go, okay, this is very Faulknerian in the sense that as a grown man, he can look at this child and know the questions the child has, or the confusion, or the answers he doesn't have, and kind of project those.
but the child says it. Chet says it like it sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like,
So I'm not sure. I do think,
a reliable narrator then?
well, exactly. And
Is he a reliable narrator then? Just because he said that that's what he said, is that really what he said, The whole literary device of not having a reliable narrator.
yes, but y'all, that's my question about any autobiography you have ever read. Because when you are crafting your own story, it's about your identity, right? And I don't know if any of us is particularly reliable. I thought about that, when I was,
None of us are.
it's real uncomfortable, because I thought about that, a couple of weeks ago, or whenever my father passed away, you know, all of the children together, and we're all, you know, adults now, and they start talking about my childhood in ways I don't recognize at all. Have y'all ever had that? Where you're going, wait, I was there. That's not what happened. And then you go, when you are crafting your own story, and that's at the heart of this novel, how stories work and what power it can have. Is he a reliable narrator? I doubt it. But is it off-putting? In other words, do you come away from it going, well, this kid is so full of it, I don't know. But I think about, I love talking about autobiography because it's a genre of writing readers love, because you think you're getting in on some scoop, right? And that first person narration always draws readers in, because the narrator's creating this kind of intimacy between the reader and the character. But then I think about the autobiographies I've read. So like Zora Neale Hurston, you know, Zora Neale, love. In her autobiography, she just completely leaves out her first marriage, which I totally get. You know what I mean? And people, oh my gosh, critics went crazy about that, right? That she left out an entire marriage.
Her prerogative.
Yes, that's it.
And memories are valuable. Every time you recall a memory, it changes, you know, it's part of, you
Where you
know.
are.
You're totally getting it. This is a book about memory. Go ahead.
The first part of it. I read like one of the case histories, like I've been working with, as a volunteer for the judge, about children, and you handed one of these cases. It reads like this: you don't read it and go to bed. You need to read it in the morning, you can go find people and talk to them. Because unless things are changing, the numbers may be changed, but probably 1,000 children now in the city, we don't know what to say for them.
Right.
And so, read that, you're gonna be very busy, and you should read it before you go to bed. But also, when things happen in your life when you're very young, I think you remember things that maybe other people might not remember. Like, I had a childhood that was like I didn't have a mother in it. And then that suddenly changed. So I think you remember things. And I think children who are traumatized,
Yes.
are different.
Yeah.
Like he's an adult from a very young age, and some things you can remember because they are so different from what's around.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a stark contrast.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I want you to think about that I think is maybe super powerful about this book is that in this world where Demon seems to have so few choices, yes? Crafting his own story is the choice, right? If he is crafting his story and crafting his identity, then that might really matter, right? One of the, you know, the other things he says about Christianity that I love is, as someone who taught many years of Baptist Sunday school, is that, you know, the Bible is just a collection of superhero stories, which I love, because in a way, that's not wrong, yes? And, you know, teaching those Bible stories to children, I just remember how so often that is how they were interpreting it. I mean, come on. A guy gets swallowed by a whale, That's a good story, yes. And then, I mean, just, you know, David, come on. It's a superhero story.
But then that's what Demon likes to create, or superhero stories.
Yes. And so from the beginning, he keeps doing this for you. Oh, yeah. I really like drawing superheroes, right? And then, oh yeah, the Bible is like superheroes. And so what I want you to keep an eye on is the way in which all of those things will merge, right? And making the choices in terms of how stories go is enormously empowering.
So a lot of his
Not only
superheroes.
naming superheroes, but naming their gift.
Ta-da! Look how beautifully formed. So let's talk about naming for a minute. Oh wait,
But a lot
All
of his superheroes turn out to be not so heroic.
yes. Well, some are villains, right?
Well, no,
They're
some
always
are
flawed.
heroes, but then later they become
Yes.
not heroes.
Always. So this power of naming is also harkens back to this folklore belief that a name is something, a name marks your identity. And I always think about that because when I read about it in literature or even the Bible, I'm going, yeah, I totally get that. I don't always get it in real life, but I do in some cases. That was all very vague. Let me be specific. So for example, at the very beginning, Demon goes through a number of times talking about the power of calling something into creation, the power of words. And of course, that harkens all the way back to Genesis, yes? Speaking something into being. And naming is one of those things that connects to the creation of something. And he goes through this very clear explanation of how he goes from Damon Fields to Demon Copperhead to
Diamond.
which I love. In that whole Creaky Farm episode, which I kind of love, where you get this little, you know, inner group of boys, adolescents, and they each not only do they have nicknames, but then the quarterback names them something else. And at one point, Demons, and the quarterback calls him Diamond, yes?
Actually, one of the other boys gives him that name.
I don't remember that.
It's I can't remember.
So you've got Tommy Waddles, swap out, fast forward, whose name is actually Sterling Ford, which I love, right? It's such a movie star name. And they also name themselves the Hillbilly Squadron. And that Tommy, okay, so it's 74 is when they have the initiation party. Fast forward said every member of our squadron had a secret name he alone could give them, including some kids that weren't even here anymore. Now I was to get mine. Tommy was Bones because of the skeleton doodles. Not heartbreaking at all. And also because underneath it all, Tommy had good bones. I could see that. And swap out was Wild Man. So what about the Demon? He looked at me for the longest time, head cocked back, the wild, dark, curly mane, his eyes squinted like he's rummaging around in my skull closet. Finally, he said, Diamond. He's bright and shiny and worth a lot. Harder than anything else there is. And on the one hand, that name only exists in this secret little club of 4. But later, Demon says that Sterling has the greatest impact on his identity. So I want you to think about that. And remember, fast forward, I love that, is also the first person who really values his drawing, who sees him as something more than anyone else has seen him as. And so, go ahead.
Or the thought of everybody in Appalachia looks down on everybody, and we're the dogs, right? And so here's one character who takes somebody and moves them up.
Yeah, that power of naming is like a blessing, isn't it? Almost, you know, when he calls him Diamond and says that he is rare and special, that's never happened. And
You took his word for the gospel and felt like a bigger person for having him notice you.
there you go. Look at the language, right? That's not how
Right.
he talks. And so I want you to note as you move through the next, let's try to get through 100 pages, how often, so let's think about all the things you've talked about, but also my thing, the Sin Eater.
Yeah.
People in the folklore world would be very impressed by that. That's all I'm saying. I want you to think about the reliability of the narrator. I want you to think about the power of naming and words, because in a world in which this child is completely disenfranchised, what does he have to work with, right? And I also want you to pay attention, because whereas in a book like the Poisonwood Bible, you know, it's religion, 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 religion. Here, it's very subtle, but I think super important, especially in terms of the huge human questions she's asking, like, why are some people born into nothing? And why are other people born into what seems to be a world of enormous advantage? It's one of the most, I've never been able to actually answer that question because it's so hard. Yes? Does predestination include who you're born to?
No.
It's just, so no, is that right?
Yeah.
So that's a no?
You know, predestination is just that your mama loves you. That's all. That's what predestination.
No, it's not.
Yes, it is. It is. It's not predetermined.
Now oh.
Yes, it is.
No, it is not.
Well, look at this melee at the end of class.
It is not.
John, I can write that down for my research for the week. Because I just finished the Puritans and they think it is.
Predestination is that you will have as many children as stars in the sky. And so if you're a child of Abraham, there's nothing you can do about it.
Predestination is that God's plan will ultimately prevail.
Yeah, but it is the big, it's not the little plan. It's the big.
So that's the question. Okay, so that is like a head banging question, isn't it?
Yeah.
The big plan versus the little plan, because then you have all that stuff about how, you know, all the little sparrows
Okay.
and,
To me, it is, in scripture, it is, you take people who are nothing and
yes,
you tell them that they're the light of the world, or that you tell them that they're children of God. And you look at them and you go, no, they're nothing. But they say, no, we're the children of God.
Wow.
So,
I have to think about all of that. That was very interesting. I'll be doing some research on you people this week. That's so interesting.
that's what's going on here.
Yeah, well, that's what I
Nancy,
was thinking.
yeah,
I wouldn't have made that connection, but that is what's going on.
but when he says gospel, that's the gospel.
And it sort of elevates fast forward in a way that you wouldn't otherwise, right? Because he, the one who is the golden child in an icky sort of way, but also remember, he's also self-preserving, right? Do you remember when he refuses to take the blame for the water, the well?
Yeah.
But then he's the one who does that. Oh, that just hurt my head a little. Okay, 100 more pages? It's a good book, isn't it?
It is.
I don't think it's her best book, do you?
No.
What is her best book?
I think it's Poisonwood Bible.
Yeah.
I don't.
But I'm not gonna, yeah, totally is. Here's what I'll say. Some critics are arguing it is her best book. I've read,
Poisonwood Bible, too. That's just
Is what?
too easy. Taking time.
some of it is easy.
Yeah.
I think you're right, but some of this is easy too. Because she sort of does that same thing, where in places in Poisonwood, she's very sort of,
Yeah.
oh, you missionaries, blah, 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 right?
Yeah.
But then there's also some great Faulkner stuff in there. Okay, I'll stop, but I love you all. Read another 100 pages and we'll figure out by the end if this is the best.
Fall break next week, for some people, but are we still meeting?
Donovan,
Moving.
we keep moving.
Church never stops.
Okay.
I know, I didn't realize it was fall break for y'all too. All right, y'all, have a good night.
Actually, my favorite book of hers is High Tide and Low.
And,
I know, I'm just thinking the exact.
That's right.
I know he does. It's just, in these meetings,